All About Fornication by Dag Heward-Mills. Few Christian books confront sexual sin with the bluntness, urgency, and pastoral insistence of Dag Heward-Mills' All About Fornication, a work that reads less like a polite moral treatise and more like an alarm sounded in the night. Written with the emotional tone of a shepherd who believes lives are at stake, the book blends warning, instruction, and hope into a forceful call to holiness grounded in scripture and lived experience. All About Fornication advances a single, uncompromising thesis. Sexual immorality is not a minor moral lapse but a spiritually destructive force that undermines individual believers, families, churches, and societies. Heward-Mills defines fornication clearly and early, framing it as sexual intercourse outside of marriage and placing it squarely against biblical teaching. He argues that modern Christianity has normalized what Scripture condemns, creating spiritual vulnerability within the church itself. The book proceeds to outline concrete consequences spiritual, physical, emotional, and social that arise from sexual sin. Rather than relying solely on abstract theology, the author integrates pastoral observation, medical realities, and biblical narratives to reinforce his case. A significant portion of the work is devoted to explaining why God's commands exist, portraying them as protective rather than punitive. Heward-Mills emphasizes that obedience precedes blessing and that repeated disobedience carries cumulative costs. The book also recognizes human weakness, acknowledging temptation as universal rather than exceptional. Importantly, it does not stop at diagnosis. It offers practical strategies for avoidance rooted in discipline, wisdom, and accountability. These strategies are divided into physical and spiritual practices, underscoring the holistic nature of Christian living. Throughout, the tone remains direct but pastoral, warning without despairing. The author insists that freedom is possible through truth, prayer, and grace. The ultimate message is restorative. Holiness is difficult but achievable, and God's grace remains available to those who choose obedience. Chapter 1: Fornication. The opening chapter establishes the conceptual and theological foundation of the book. Heward-Mills begins by defining fornication in unambiguous terms, removing any interpretive vagueness that might allow readers to minimize the subject. He situates this definition firmly within biblical language, particularly Pauline exhortations that call believers to moral distinctiveness. The chapter's primary concern is diagnostic. It names fornication as a widespread but under-acknowledged problem within contemporary Christian communities, including charismatic churches often associated with spiritual vitality. The chapter's primary concern is diagnostic. It names fornication as a widespread but under-acknowledged problem within contemporary Christian communities, including charismatic churches often associated with spiritual vitality. Chapter 2: 15 Reasons Why You Should Not Commit Fornication. This chapter forms the argumentative core of the book, presenting a structured list of 15 reasons that collectively portray fornication as destructive on multiple levels. Each reason is anchored in Scripture and expanded through explanation, anecdote, or practical implication. Heward-Mills moves fluidly between spiritual consequences such as soul damage and demonic influence and tangible outcomes like disease, broken relationships, and social instability. The cumulative effect is intentional. The reader is not meant to evaluate each reason in isolation but to feel the weight of their convergence. Particularly striking is the emphasis on covenantal implications, where sexual activity is described as spiritually binding rather than merely physical. The chapter's tone is urgent and repetitive by design, reinforcing the seriousness of the issue through sustained attention. It is less a debate than a sustained moral indictment meant to persuade through accumulation. Chapter 3: Physical Steps to Avoiding Fornication. Having established why fornication is dangerous, Heward-Mills turns to pragmatic prevention. This chapter focuses on external behaviors, relational boundaries, and life decisions that reduce vulnerability to sexual sin. The author addresses issues often neglected in spiritual discourse, such as the timing of relationships, delayed marriage, and cultural norms surrounding intimacy. He argues that holiness is not sustained by intention alone, but by structural wisdom choices that limit temptation before it arises. The chapter treats marriage not merely as a moral requirement but as a protective institution designed by God. Heward-Mills also critiques both overt and subtle forms of polygamy, identifying cultural patterns that normalize infidelity. The underlying assumption is that spiritual discipline must be supported by practical arrangements, making holiness a lived strategy rather than an abstract goal. Chapter 4: Spiritual Steps to Avoiding Fornication. The final chapter completes the book's holistic framework by addressing internal and spiritual disciplines. Heward-Mills emphasizes honesty as the gateway to freedom, arguing that secrecy perpetuates bondage. Prayer is presented not as ritual but as spiritual reinforcement, strengthening believers against temptation before it manifests. The chapter balances accountability with compassion, reinforcing the book's pastoral intent. It closes the argument by returning responsibility to the reader, insisting that freedom requires both divine help and human cooperation. The book's structure is linear, didactic, and intentionally repetitive. This design suits its pastoral purpose: clarity over elegance, reinforcement over novelty. Each chapter builds logically upon the previous one, moving from definition to consequence to prevention. While literary critics may prefer more subtle transitions, the straightforward progression ensures accessibility for a broad audience. Central themes include obedience, holiness, spiritual warfare, covenant, and grace. Heward-Mills consistently frames obedience as relational rather than legalistic, arguing that God's commands are expressions of care. The theme of covenant is particularly distinctive, elevating sexual ethics beyond morality into spiritual ontology. The prose is direct, conversational, and sermon-like. Heward-Mills writes as a preacher addressing a congregation, frequently employing rhetorical questions and illustrative anecdotes. The tone is urgent but not hysterical, authoritative without detachment. Short scriptural quotations are integrated seamlessly, functioning as anchors rather than embellishments. The pacing is deliberate and methodical. Chapter 2 is intentionally long and dense, reflecting its central role. Later chapters accelerate toward application, providing relief from sustained warning by offering practical hope. While the theological content aligns with traditional Christian sexual ethics, the originality lies in the book's integration of spiritual, physical, medical, and sociological perspectives. Heward-Mills does not innovate doctrine but reframes familiar teachings with renewed urgency and specificity. This book will resonate strongly with committed Christians seeking moral clarity in a permissive culture, particularly pastors, youth leaders, and believers in discipleship contexts. Readers uncomfortable with direct moral language or skeptical of spiritual explanations may find the tone confrontational. However, those open to pastoral instruction will appreciate its clarity and seriousness. Compared to Joshua Harris's I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Heward-Mills is less reflective and more prescriptive, prioritizing warning over introspection. In contrast to C.S. Lewis's measured moral reasoning in Mere Christianity, Heward-Mills adopts a prophetic urgency rooted in pastoral observation rather than philosophical abstraction. All About Fornication is not a gentle book, and it is not intended to be. Dag Heward-Mills writes with the conviction of a pastor who believes silence is itself a form of harm. The book's greatest strength lies in its moral clarity. It refuses to negotiate with cultural trends or psychological rationalizations that weaken biblical sexual ethics. For readers seeking comfort, the book may feel severe. For readers seeking truth, it is bracing. Heward-Mills does not promise ease, but he does promise coherence. Obedience leads to life, disobedience to loss. As a long-form pastoral intervention, the book succeeds because it integrates theology, lived observation, and practical guidance without fragmenting them. Its repetition reinforces seriousness rather than monotony, and its direct tone ensures accessibility across educational backgrounds. While critics may desire greater engagement with opposing viewpoints or modern psychological frameworks, such omissions are consistent with the book's purpose. All About Fornication is not a debate, it is a warning. For pastors, youth leaders, counselors, and believers navigating sexual temptation in a permissive culture, this book is strongly recommended. It is best read slowly, discussed communally, and revisited periodically. Those willing to be confronted will find not condemnation, but a rigorous call to holiness grounded in the conviction that God's commands exist for human flourishing. To fully appreciate All About Fornication, it is helpful to situate it within the broader tradition of Christian moral theology. Heward-Mills's approach aligns with a formation-based ethic rather than a purely rule-based system. Sexual sin is treated not merely as an infraction, but as a formative act that reshapes desires, habits, and spiritual sensitivity. This emphasis echoes early Christian writers who viewed bodily practices as inseparable from spiritual perception. In this sense, the book participates in a long-standing theological anthropology that understands humans as integrated beings rather than divided selves. The repeated insistence that fornication damages the soul may feel abstract to modern readers accustomed to compartmentalization. Yet Heward-Mills's argument is internally coherent. If sexuality is covenantal, then misuse has covenantal consequences. The book's theological strength lies in its refusal to reduce sex to recreation or identity. Instead, sex is framed as spiritually consequential, capable of binding, wounding, and shaping destiny. This perspective challenges both secular permissiveness and shallow religious moralism. Although written within a Christian framework, the book speaks into broader cultural conversations about commitment, discipline, and delayed gratification. In an age that celebrates immediacy and personal autonomy, Heward-Mills advocates restraint as wisdom. His warnings about emotional fragmentation, disease, and relational instability intersect with sociological findings, even when interpreted theologically. The book's relevance is therefore not limited to ecclesial contexts, though its language presumes belief. As a work of pastoral theology, All About Fornication is unapologetic, cohesive, and demanding. Its value lies not in novelty but in seriousness. Heward-Mills assumes that truth must sometimes wound before it heals, and he structures his argument accordingly. Readers willing to submit to that process will find the book clarifying and strengthening. Readers unwilling will still encounter a voice of rare conviction. For its intended audience, the book accomplishes its purpose with force and fidelity.